Welcome to our program. We're going to be talking about money, one of our favorite subjects. We're always complaining about it. We never seem to have enough of it. Our income tax eats it up. Our mortgage eats it up. What if we lose our jobs? Much of the world appears to be money hungry. Why? Well, our governments tell us that we don't have the money, that we have to tighten our belts in this new global economy, work harder for less. So we are told. The point is, money plays a central role in our interpersonal, national, and global existence. And yet, how much do we really know about it? We're told that we must walk a fine line between having too much or too little money in circulation at any one time. If there's too little money in circulation, the economy will grind to a halt. Too much? Well, then we will have inflation. And we will be talking about that later on. We think we understand the pros and cons of money so well, and yet very few people know how most of our money is created each year, and more to the point, who creates it. Now, don't you find that strange? Money is so central to our lives, you would think we would at least know how it is created. But there's a very good reason why you may not know how most of our money is created each year. Those who create it don't want you to know, because if you did know, then you would realize two things. Number one, that we do have enough money for our social needs. And number two, the way in which money is created directly affects the quality of your life and the lives of those around you. Initially, the answer to the question, how is money created, is easy. Everybody gets it. The government prints it. Absolutely. In Canada, the government of Canada creates money using the federal bank, the Bank of Canada. Printing may refer either to the printing of money or printing through computer printouts. We will simply say the creation of money. Now, the next question is a bit trickier. How much of the money created each year does the government create? 100%? 70%? 40%? 15%? 5%? "5% is the correct answer. Actually, at the moment, in 2002, it's somewhat less than 5%. That's this stuff here, printed money, the bucks, dinero, the good stuff. Well, our next question seems obvious. If the government only creates less than 5% of the money each year through the Bank of Canada, then how is more than 95% of our money created each year, and who creates it? Now that is the multi-trillion-dollar question.
When I was writing Funny Money, I asked 100 people where money came from. And they were doctors, dentists, bankers, business people, newspaper publishers, newspaper editors-in-chief, and financial columnists. And first of all, they were reluctant to answer the question. I said, go ahead, it won't bite you. And they said, well, the government prints it. I said, well, what proportion of the new money created each year does the government print? The lowest estimate was 60% and the highest 100. If that was true, we'd have a very, very different system than the one we've got. But what it showed was that of that 100 people, not one had a working knowledge of the monetary system. Not one. And yet they are the people who have told our government what to do and who are responsible, in a way indirectly, for much that has gone wrong in recent years. In fact, the Government of Canada, through the Bank of Canada, has only printed about 5% of the money. That's what you carry around, legal tender that you carry around in your pocketbook or purse to spend for a Big Mac or whatever on the weekend. 95% of the new money created in Canada each year is printed by the private banks. And if it offends you to call it printing, we'll call it creating or manufacturing. It's all the same. And the way it works is this. If you go to a bank and want to borrow $30,000 to buy a car, they'll ask you for some collateral. And if you have some stocks or bonds you can give them, fine. If not, they'll ask you for a second mortgage in your house or cottage. And if you don't have that, why, they'll ask you if you have a friend or a relative who will co-sign the note. You satisfy them on the collateral. You sign a note for the $30,000, repayable plus interest at prime rate plus 1.5 or 2.5, depending on the color of your eyes. And as soon as you sign the note, they tap their computer and presto, $30,000 appears in your account that you can go out and spend to buy the car. Seconds earlier, that money did not exist. The myth, of course, is that the money they lend you today is the money I deposited yesterday. Not true. When you borrow from the bank, they create the money that they lend to you.
Time for our next question. So what? Well, here's the difference. According to the Bank of Canada Act, which we will be taking a look at in a moment, the Bank of Canada can issue essentially interest-free loans to the federal government. It can also issue loans to lower levels of government, provincial or municipal governments. These latter loans are not interest-free, but they may be acquired at rates well below private bank rates. And we will be looking at the benefits of central bank loans to lower levels of government later on. Money created by a nation's central bank is called government-created money. Now, private banks, on the other hand, of course, charge interest, substantial interest, for their loans. Particularly so since, in recent years, banks have been deregulated so that now they may charge whatever fees they wish. Money created by the private banking system is called bank-created money. Now, for you and me, businesses and corporations, well, we're stuck with the private banking system. But governments have either choice. For our next question, we will look at the choices federal, that is, national, governments make. Which do you think national governments choose? Interest-free loans from their own central banks, government-created money, or interest-bearing loans from the private banking system, bank-created money? Since we have already established that 95% of the money created each year is bank-created money, the answer is obvious. National governments around the world borrow from private banking systems, domestic and foreign, at substantial interest rates, rather than using the all but interest-free facilities of their own central banks. And this has been going on for years. But to answer our question, so what? Let's look at the results, at least here in Canada. According to the Canadian Federal Department of Finance, the net federal debt as of March 2001 is $547.4 billion. It is the result of the Canadian government borrowing from the private banking system at substantial interest rates rather than from its own central bank. To see what this means, we will look at another figure. Again, according to the Canadian Federal Department of Finance, we note the net expenditures for Canada as of March 2001. The breakdown of expenditures is revealing. It shows that the interest alone on the $547.4 billion net public debt, the public debt interest, is the largest expenditure. That expenditure, of course, is paid for out of revenues, primarily our tax dollars, yours and mine. Obviously, if the net public debt could be paid down, there would be less public debt interest to pay, and our tax dollars could go elsewhere, where Canadians want it to go, into support for federal social programs and into transfer payments to the provinces and municipalities for their programs, rather than into the private banking system. Presumably, this alternative would be of interest to activists and to politicians at all levels of government. But that's not quite the whole story. There is more debt. The net federal debt of $547.4 billion does not include provincial or municipal debts. Almost without exception, the public debt interest is the third or fourth largest provincial expenditure beyond healthcare, education, and social services. So what then is the sum total of Canada's debt? According to Stats Canada, the consolidated federal, provincial, territorial, and local government net debt is approximately $830.4 billion. Before we move on, let us consider, can the net public debt ever be paid off? Not if we continue to borrow from the private banking system. Paul Hellyer explains why.
Well, the problem is that this 95% of all new money created by the banks is created as debt. And it's debt on which interest has to be paid. And so you ask yourself this question: if 95% of all of the money is created as debt, which it is, and on all of that, interest has to be paid, which is the case, and no one creates any money with which to pay the interest that's due, what do you have to do? And the answer is you have to go out and borrow more in order to pay the interest on what you already owe.
Well, what about the other option? Can our economy function, our social needs be met, and government debts paid down over time if we were to use more government-created money and less bank-created money? That same question, by the way, could be asked of any of the G8 countries. But for Canada, we will take a look at the powers of the Bank of Canada through a few sections of the Bank of Canada Act. Now, this may be a bit tedious, but do bear with us. It will only take a moment to outline the existing legal and structural foundation for the material that follows in our program. Fortunately, everything we require to get the economy moving again remains available to us in the pages of the Bank of Canada Act. The Bank of Canada Act was passed by the Parliament of Canada in 1934. The preamble sets forth the bank's mandate: to control and protect the external value of the national monetary unit, and to mitigate by its influence fluctuations in the general level of production, trade, prices, and employment, so far as it may be possible within the scope of monetary action. Further, the Act notes that the bank's capital shall be divided into 100,000 shares, which shall be issued to the Minister of Finance, to be held by the Minister on behalf of Her Majesty in right of Canada. We hear a great deal about the independence of the Bank of Canada, yet it is stated clearly in the Act that, should there emerge a difference of opinion between the Minister and Bank concerning the monetary policy to be followed, the Minister may give to the Governor of the Bank a written directive concerning monetary policy in specific terms and applicable for a specific period, and the Bank shall comply with that directive. Of prime importance are two sections which outline the Bank's capacity to hold debt. Section 18C provides that the Bank may hold funded debt, buy and sell securities issued or guaranteed by Canada or any province. And 18J deals with the ability of the Bank to hold unfunded debt, that is, short-term debt that is more like a line of credit for meeting emergency needs.
Now, the significance of all this extends far beyond the mere numbers. Here you have the Charter of the Bank of Canada provides that the Minister of Finance has the right, in the event of a serious disagreement with the Governor of the Bank of Canada, to give him 30 days to comply, or gets his marching papers. It also bears witness to the fact that there is one shareholder of the Bank of Canada, which is the Government of Canada. Finally, it makes it clear that the Bank of Canada has the purpose of diminishing, of mitigating fluctuations, amongst other things, in trade and employment. And last of all, there is clear provision for the Bank of Canada to hold not only federal debt, but provincial debt. Now, all these things add up to ownership, and ownership is the very core of the capitalist system. What we are doing and asking for is just that the privileges of ownership be respected when it's the nation that are the owners. Now, the Government of Canada is denying the fruits of ownership to the people of this country. You will ask, what difference does all this make? And the answer is a very, very important one. You see, when the Bank of Canada holds federal debt, the interest that the government pays on that debt finds its way substantially back to that government as dividends. When private banks hold that debt, that interest stays with them. Now, I should make it very, very clear that when the Bank of Canada holds provincial debt, that doesn't happen because the provinces are not shareholders of the Bank of Canada. But that opens a new dimension of understanding and compromise between the federal government and the provinces and the municipalities. The same goes for municipal debt. The federal government could do a deal with the provinces to return 1/2 or 3/4 or the entire amount, depending upon the way the negotiations go, of the interest that the junior level of government pays, in return for that junior level of government respecting national standards in the projects that the Bank of Canada loan is financing. In essence, it would be a loan to the lower level governments well below market rates. And we are choking with the burden of debt imposed upon us.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in 20 minutes. You now know that money is created in two ways: through a nation's central bank and by the private banking system. Money is simply a medium of exchange. One can almost say it's created out of nothing, but not quite. Specifically, it is created out of a faith based on the credit of a nation. Otherwise, it would be worthless. You also now know that the problem with having the private banks create 95% of our money is the burdensome interest payments, as our expenditures sheet illustrates. And just to be clear, these figures do not include the public debt interest on provincial or municipal debts. Our tax money goes towards such interest payments rather than towards more equitable tax refunds or the funding of federal and provincial social and infrastructure programs via transfer payments and otherwise. Well, clearly, the private banks should be creating less money, and this would cause them no harm, as they would still be making considerable profits. And national banks should be creating more money, which would be essentially interest-free at the federal level, and, as William Krem was saying, available to lower levels of government, provincial and municipal governments, at interest rates well below private bank rates. Again, this option should be of great, if you'll pardon the pun, interest to activists and to politicians in all levels of government. Moreover, we are not suggesting anything new. This is exactly what was done shortly after the Bank of Canada was formed, during the war years, and beyond. And the result?
Pretty soon, everybody is working. They're in the armed forces, building factories, or making munitions. Unemployment, which had been double-digit, was down to about 1%. And you say, how did they finance it? Where did they get the money? Well, it's very simple. The Bank of Canada printed it. P-R-I-N-T-E-D. The Bank of Canada printed the money to buy government bonds. And then it paid the Bank of Canada interest on those bonds. And the Bank of Canada gave that interest back to the government as dividends. So that the net cost of that money was just above zero, just the cost of administration deducted. And the money that was created and the government had was spent into circulation. And it wound up in the private banks, where it was what the economists called high-powered money. And high-powered money, with the system we had then, was the monetary base which allowed the banks to expand their credit money or virtual money so that they could increase their loans to finance new factories or to lend money to people to buy war bonds and that sort of thing. It was the system, in effect, of sharing the money creation function between the people and government of Canada through the Bank of Canada and the private banks. It is the system that got us out of the Great Depression, that helped finance the war, that helped finance the post-war infrastructure, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Trans-Canada Highway, the great airports, and laid the foundation for our social security system, which became one of the best in the world. It was the system that gave us the best 25 years of the 20th century. But in 1974, it all changed, because that was the year that the Bank of Canada, in concert with other central banks, abandoned that system, adopted the ideas of Milton Friedman and his colleagues at the University of Chicago, and has been downhill ever since. And part of that change was to give back to the private banks their virtual monopoly to create money. In 1974, the Bank of Canada owned more than 20% of federal government debt, which was the same as an interest-free loan. Today, just a little over 5%. When they stopped buying their share of bonds, that's when they started bribing foreigners to buy the bonds they didn't buy. And that's when we got into hock, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Americans. A dreadful error in judgment, and one that we haven't recovered from yet.
We don't have the money. We don't have the money. We don't have the money for, you name it. But we do have the money. It's collected through our taxes. That's not the problem. It never was. The problem is where the money is going. In a nutshell, 95% of the money supply is created by the private banking system. A significant proportion of our monies through taxes is paid into the private banking system as interest payments on the monies we borrow from them. And let's be clear here, these payments are of such a magnitude that they are choking the life out of our economic and social systems on a yearly basis, year after year. Why is this happening? Because for whatever the reasons may be, we choose not to create our own interest-free money using the powers and capacities of our own national central bank. The question we must ask then is as follows. Since the Bank of Canada Act empowers the Bank of Canada to create interest-free money at the federal level, and since this has in fact been done before, and with great success, and since it would benefit all Canadians as debt and interest payments to the private banking system would decrease over time, why isn't it done? One of the reasons why it isn't done, that is, why there is not a greater percentage of government-created money in circulation, is that the question itself is hardly ever raised by politicians, the media, or by academics. So there is very little knowledge or public discussion of it. So on those rare occasions when it is raised, it appears to come out of left field, and those who raise it are considered suspect at best. Especially so since when you get right down to it, the situation really is almost too preposterous to believe. The very idea of a government that can create money for itself, allowing banks to create money that the government then borrows and pays interest on, is so preposterous that it staggers the imagination. Paul Hellyer, in his book, Funny Money, describes it this way. He notes he's had considerable practice in digging for words to describe situations. But in this case, I found nothing seemed adequate. Ridiculous, inane, insane, grotesque, absurd, and other adjectives crossed my mind, but in each case, they failed to portray the enormity of the situation and the outrage that fills my mind when I think how perverse the system really is. Finally, one evening, as I was contemplating the stars and distant galaxies, the word infinite came to mind. That was it. Our present monetary system is an infinitely silly system. And there is another reason why the prospect of government-created money is not considered viable. Should the question of government-created money somehow, somewhere, find its way into public debate, a stock answer has been devised which abruptly ends all further discussion. To create money using the central bank would cause inflation. Well, of course there would be inflation if we simply printed billions of dollars and distributed it piecemeal, but that is not what is being said. We are suggesting that, of the sum total of money created each year, that a larger percentage of it, a considerably larger percentage of it, be government-created money, thus detracting from government debts. And a smaller percentage of it be bank-created money, which add to government debts. This really is not all that hard to understand. We have seen that these truly horrendous interest payments claim a substantial proportion of our federal and provincial expenditures. As to inflation, if Canada were to create and spend government money into circulation, statutory reserves would have to be re-established on the private banks, precisely to inhibit inflation, since government-created money would find its way back into the private banking system. The way in which statutory reserves were quietly done away with in 1991 is shameful, and the consequences shocking.
And this is how it was done. The banks used to be required to deposit a modest amount of the public's deposits that they held with the Bank of Canada, and they didn't earn any interest on these statutory reserves, as they were called. In 1991, they were phased out and had completely disappeared by 1993. That helped to make it possible for the private banks to take on another $60 billion worth of federal debt without putting up a significant amount of money. In addition, they were relieved of the statutory deposits supporting the $20 billion of federal debt that they held before this. It amounted to not a one-shot bailout, but an entitlement that comes back every year, like spring and autumn and deep winter. And the result of this was that the federal government ended up spending more on interest that it didn't have to pay than it spends on all its social programs. And that's where we are today. So the federal government really is morally obliged to explore these avenues of compromise.
For example, if in Canada we were to reestablish statutory reserves and move towards a goal of, say, 20% government-created money, as it was in the early 1970s, that would be a starting point. It would allow us the financing for jobs and programs necessary to help accomplish the following: adequate funding for health care, universal access to post-secondary education, grants and low-cost loans to municipalities, sustainable development, aid to farmers, reduce government debt and therefore the taxes spent on interest, help Aboriginal peoples, revitalize the armed forces. An increase in the government-created money supply would result in a win-win situation. It would help to establish a new atmosphere in Canada, one of national stability, social security, and individual confidence. And it would still allow the financial community to make ample profits. Let us consolidate what is being said in 5 points. Number 1, Canada has pursued a monetary policy which has resulted in close to $1 trillion being owed to financial institutions and their associates, both domestic and foreign-based. And similar situations exist in all of the G8 countries. Number 2, these debts can never be paid off under current conditions. The peoples of the world, their children and grandchildren and on, will be obliged through their monies, via taxes, to pay for these debts in perpetuity unless changes are made. Number 3, there exists in every nation state a possible remedy for this ridiculous situation. It's called the central bank. Number 4, the effective use of a nation-state central bank to provide government-created money to national and regional governments would provide jobs, increase the standard of living, and provide for the development of effective environmental protection programs, and still leave plenty of room for financial institutions to make handsome profits. Number 5, there is a media blackout on any serious discussion of the options inherent in government-created money. An illustration might help explain another reason why government-created money is not considered a priority. Suppose we make a list of important issues. We might have environmental issues as number 1, followed by, say, healthcare, education, then the fight against poverty and racism, the battle for social justice, welfare, and so on. Where would we place financial reform? At the top? In the middle? Towards the end? Such a list would be misleading. It would indicate a misunderstanding of the fundamental role that money plays in our social structure. Monetary reform would never be too high on such a list because it is much more intangible than the items on the list. And yet, without it, it is very likely that the issues on the list will never be resolved because they all need money. And under current conditions, there will never be enough money for them. Monetary reform is not an item on such a list. It underwrites the list. Now, you may disagree with this, but consider, should we expect the private banking system or private sector institutions to provide the needed fundings for the items on this list? No, they're in the private sector. Well, the government doesn't create enough money to do it. So what are we to do about the items on such a list? We allow, or are in the process of allowing, the private sector to manage the issues on the list which make money, like healthcare and education. And those that don't, like the environment and public sector social programs, well, they're out of luck. Most of the items on the list, actually, will be out of luck. One could argue that governments worldwide have abandoned or been forced to abandon the responsibility for the well-being of their citizens over the last 30 years by allowing bank-created money to dominate the money creation process. This truly is an infinitely silly system when one realizes that a ready-made, tried and proven solution, government-created money, sits idly by on the sidelines, unused. And last but hardly least, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why government-created money and what it has to offer is never discussed, is downplayed, or is dismissed outright as a workable option. Government-created money would compete with bank-created money and potential private sector profits. Any national government which would try to increase the government-created money supply would be targeted by the financial community, much of the private sector, and other governments. If one government were to successfully create money for use on behalf of its citizens, other governments might also try to do so. It's as simple as that, no more, no less. Our vision of a pluralistic democracy is at virtual war with unregulated capital, and at the moment, the latter is winning hands down. Now, we say at virtual war because this war is not being fought with weapons, but with the ebb and flow of capital, money. By replacing the reality of ourselves and the earth with abstract fiscal indicators, we are becoming a kind of schizoid or Orwellian society, wherein signs mean the exact opposite of what they refer to. So, for example, layoffs cause the stock market to rise. And the very stuff we are made of, the environment and the welfare of each other, are considered to be externals, too costly to bother with. The money creation function serves a critical role in determining the course and the quality of our social systems. Now, this is not to say that government-created money will solve all problems. Of course it won't. However, as a nation-state, we have a fundamental right to create our own money for the benefit of the greater good, and not to borrow it at interest in order to benefit only a very few. In our next section, William Krem outlines one of the many applications government-created money has in order to bring about productive social change.
Solutions can be designed in a number of ways. For example, there are many things that most people will agree are better going down than up, provided that it's feasible. For example, most people would prefer having lower rather than higher taxes. Most people, if it were feasible, would prefer lower interest rates rather than higher interest rates. Let's see if we can't combine these two things with the insights of systems theory, of the interrelationships of the different sectors of the economy. Suppose we concentrated on the effects on the public treasury, because the deficit and the federal debt is being exploited in a rather unconscionable way. Suppose we chose two measures that most people would wish to see headed downwards rather than upwards, and one of them would lower the income of the Treasury, and the other would lower the necessary expenditures by the Treasury, so that the joint effect would be zero, so that nobody could say, where is the money coming from? No additional money would be necessary. We could, for example, take the goods and service tax, which for out non-Canadians, I should add, is the Canadian version of the value-added tax on consumable goods, on consumers' goods, and it hits the most vulnerable part of our society. Suppose we either lowered that partly or abolished it entirely, which would reduce the income of the Treasury, but this would be balanced by shifting a calculated portion of the federal debt at presently held by the private banks to the Bank of Canada. And you've already heard how that would be effectively interest-free federal debt. And what the Treasury would gain and what the Treasury would lose would balance. Now, having done that, that would be step number one. Step number two would be completely passive, nothing further done, but we monitor the effects of lower taxation, especially the GST, and lower interest rates throughout the other sectors of the economy. For example, both of these things would perk up the industry, manufacturing, be a greater market for it. And when we convinced ourselves that this outside the targeted Treasury would have broad positive effect elsewhere in the economy, we'd be ready for step three. And step three would be either to apply another dosage of these same two factors, if you hadn't done away with the GST entirely, or you could choose any other factors, paired factors, one of which would reduce the income of the Treasury and the other would reduce the expenditures, but both of which would be beneficial to society, would have collateral benefits instead of creating collateral damage as the Air Force, the American Air Force in Afghanistan. Now, you could pair these things in any way. You could choose, for example, compliance with the Kyoto Agreement, which, of course, is going to require additional expenditure by the Canadian government, and shift a further section of the debt held by the private banks to the Bank of Canada, where it belongs, of course. In this way, we would have enough money not to go on binges, but to do unpostponable things like putting roofs over the head of our homeless, adequate health care, because not doing these things has its costs. I should mention just in passing that one of the things that is necessary, and Comer proposes, is when you avoid doing something that is really necessary, that should be put on the government's books as a debt, because it's going to catch up with it sooner or later. Not putting it on the government's books as a debt is the exact equivalent for which CEOs of great corporations are being marched to jail in manacles in the United States. So, what we need, there are policies. Some of them have been tried and proved very productive in our earlier history.
Even if monetary policies were reformed, in order to function properly, we must have a workable economic theory. And that brings us to our next and final section. To address the heart of our problem, we have need of a serious economic theory. What passes for one today is little more than a decoy. Even if monetary policies are improved, they must be bounded by a theory which acknowledges that new economic subsystems have evolved over the course of the 20th century. It may come as little surprise that the prevailing economic theory is as untenable as current monetary policies. And how could it be otherwise? The two are indeed so closely intertwined. That being said, Comer hopes in the near future to develop a second program in relation to this one about economic theory and reform. The Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform has tried to demonstrate in this video that government-created money, along with some bank regulations, may be a solution to many of our monetary ills. In Canada, government-created money is entrenched by law through the Bank of Canada Act and has been shown by historical precedent to be workable and feasible. So politicians, the media, activists, all of us have a moral responsibility to consider government-created money as a credible alternative to the infinitely silly system we now have, although of course the private banking system would not consider it to be infinitely silly. But such an evaluation cannot occur in an atmosphere of disbelief or an information blackout without discussion or public debate.
What we need is dialogue. We have stated our position instead of ignoring our own history and our own needs. Let the statesmen and politicians of the other side come forward and demolish what we have to say. We can guarantee them that in such dialogue we will be as urbane as possible. We will avoid embarrassing anybody in power or out of power in what we say. We will stick to policies, what's wrong with them, what is right with them. If, in fact, what we propose is impractical, surely the other side has enough economists, academic, and in the employ of stock markets and government to step forward and reduce it to dust. If not, then the only conclusion is that they cannot discuss the matter because it won't stand discussing on their side. That brings in the ordinary citizen. He has a role that nobody else can displace. He's got to write his member of parliament. He's got to write his non-government organization if it hasn't become aware of such solutions as yet. Join the NGOs and raise the question. Raise it wherever you can. Time is running out. We haven't been faced as yet with the total costs of the last irresponsible binge. The 1929 crash took 4 years before it worked itself into the depth of the depression that ultimately brought us World War II. We've just taken a few unpleasant steps to face it, to see the real consequences of the policies of the last 20, 30 years. In the 30s, by the way, there was a complete freedom of discussion. The banks were in the doghouse. At present, they are ruling the roost and suppressing, or at least somebody is suppressing, discourse on them. That can't be tolerated without powers over money creation, the banking system. There is no democracy. There can be no democracy because there will never be any cash in the till for issues that really count.
You can do something about the problems we have described by refuting the claim that we don't have the money. Through education and public debate, you can politicize the notion of government-created money and what it can offer. One way you can do that right now is by making a copy of our program and passing it on. Send a copy to your political representative. We at Cummer hope you have found what we have had to say to be interesting and informative. We would appreciate your support through donation or membership. And thank you for watching our program.